Section 21 of Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 5, by Agnes and Elisabeth Strickland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mary, Chapter 5, Part 1. When the news arrived that the Duke of Norfolk's army was dispersed, the greatest consternation pervaded the court and city, for everyone knew that the royal residences at Westminster possessed no means of defence, excepting the stoutness of their gates, and the valour of the gentlemen at arms. The Queen's legal neighbours at Westminster Hall liked the aspect of the times so little, that they pleaded their causes clad in suits of armour, which were, however, decorously hidden by the flowing forensic robes. They followed the example set by Dr. Weston, who officiated at Whitehall Chapel for the service of Candlemas Day, early in the morning, February 2nd, before the Queen, with armour braced on under his priestly vestments, a real specimen of a clerical militant. He was indeed a most truculent polemic, proving afterwards a dreadful persecutor of the Protestants and a slanderer of the Catholics. In the midst of the warlike preparations of the valiant and the dismay of the timid, Queen Mary remained calm and collected. She ordered her horse, and, attended by her ladies and privy councillors, rode to the city. She had no intention of taking refuge within the fortified circle of London Wall, then entire and tolerably efficient. Her purpose was merely to encourage the citizens by her words and example. The Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas White, the most trusty and valiant of tailors, received his sovereign lady at Guildhall, clad in complete steel, over which warlike harness he wore the civic robe. He was attended by the aldermen, similarly accoutred. Such portentous equipments were true tokens of the exigence of the hour, for the rumour went that Wyatt, then at Southwark, was preparing to storm the city. When the Queen was placed in the chair of state, with her sceptre in her hand, she addressed the following speech to the citizens, with clearness of utterance, and no little grace of manner. I am come in mine own person to tell you what you already see and know. I mean the traitorous and seditious assembling of the Kentish rebels against us and you. Their pretence, as they say, is to resist a marriage between us and the Prince of Spain. Of all their plots and evil-contrived articles you have been informed. Since then, our council have resorted to the rebels, demanding the cause of their continued emprise. By their answers, the marriage is found to be the least of their quarrel. For, swerving from their former demands, they now arrogantly require the governance of our person, the keeping of our town, and the placing of our councillors. What I am, loving subjects, ye right well know, your queen, to whom at my coronation ye promised allegiance and obedience. I was then wedded to the realm and to the laws of the same, the spousal ring whereof I wear here on my finger, and it has never and never shall be left off. That I am the rightful and true inheritor of the English crown, I not only take all Christendom to witness, but also your acts of parliament confirming the same. My father, as ye all know, possessed the same regal estate. To him ye were always loving subjects. Therefore, I doubt not, ye will show yourselves so to me, his daughter. Not suffering any rebel, especially so presumptuous a one as this Wyatt, to usurp the government of our person. And this I say on the word of a prince. I cannot tell how naturally a mother loveth her children, for I never had any. But if subjects may be loved as a mother doth love her child, then assure yourselves that I, your sovereign lady and queen, do as earnestly love and favour you. I cannot but think that you love me in return, and thus, bound in concord, we shall be able, I doubt not, to give these rebels a speedy overthrow. Now, concerning my intended marriage, I am neither so desirous of wedding, nor so precisely wedded to my will, that I needs must have a husband. Hitherto I have lived a virgin, and I doubt not, with God's grace, to live so still. But if, as my ancestors have done, it might please God that I shall leave you a successor to be your governor, I trust you would rejoice thereat. Also, I know it be to your comfort. Yet, if I thought this marriage would endanger any of you, my loving subjects, or the royal estate of this English realm, I would never consent thereto, nor marry while I lived. On the word of a queen, I assure you, that if the marriage appear not before the high court of parliament, nobility, and commons, for the singular benefit of the whole realm, then will I abstain, not only from this, but from every other. Wherefore, good subjects, pluck up your hearts. Like true men, stand fast with your lawful sovereign against these rebels, and fear them not, for I do not, I assure you. I leave with you my Lord Howard and my Lord Treasurer, Winchester, to assist my Lord Mayor in the safeguard of the city from spoil and sack, which is the only aim of the rebellious crew. At the conclusion of this harangue, the crowd, who filled the Guildhall and its court, shouted, "God save Queen Mary and the Prince of Spain!" She mounted her horse, and rode with her train across Cheapside to the water stairs of the Three Cranes in the Vintry. When she alighted to take her barge, a hosier stepped forth from the crowd and said to her, "Your grace will do well to make your forward a battle of your bishops and priests, for they be trusty and will not deceive you." The man was arrested and sent to Newgate. The queen's barge had been appointed to wait for her at the wharf of the Three Cranes. When she entered it, she bade her rowers take her, as near as possible, to London Bridge, where the attack of Wyatt was threatened. She then was rowed to Westminster. On her arrival she held a council, in which she appointed the Earl of Pembroke general of her forces, then mustering to defend the palaces of St. James and Whitehall. An armed watch was set that night in Whitehall Palace. The hot gospeller, Mr. Edward Underhill, presented himself, to take his share of this duty, but was repulsed and driven away by his bitter adversary, Norreys, who was a Roman Catholic. Upon which, as Underhill writes, "I took a link to light me home, and went away for a night or two." 3 days of suspense passed over, in which time Wyatt, finding the city defences by the riverside too strong for him, retreated from Southwark, his people contenting themselves with plundering Winchester House, the palace of Bishop Gardiner, when they made such havoc in his library, that the destructive stood knee-deep in the leaves of torn books. The storm of civil war, averted from the city, was soon transferred to the doors of Mary's own residence. At 2 in the morning the palace of Whitehall was wakened by an alarm, brought by a deserter from the rebels, declaring that Wyatt had made a detour from the east of the metropolis on the Surrey bank of the Thames, which he had crossed at Kingston Bridge, and would be at Hyde Park Corner in 2 hours. The hurry and consternation that pervaded the palace on that winter's morning may be imagined. Barricades were raised at the points most liable to attack. Guards were stationed at the queen's bedchamber windows and her withdrawing rooms. The palace echoed with the wailings of the queen's ladies. Her royal household had been replenished with a bevy of fair and courtly dames, of a different spirit from those few faithful ladies who belonged to her little circle, when she was the persecuted Princess Mary, and who shared her flight to Framlingham. These ladies, Susan Clarenceux, Mary Finch, and Mary Brown, and the granddaughter of Sir Thomas More, were with her still in places of high trust, but they had been too well inured to the caprice of Mary's fortunes to behave according to Edward Underhill's account of their colleagues. "The queen's ladies," he said, "made the greatest lamentations that night. They wept and wrung their hands, and, from their exclamations, may be judged the state of the interior of Whitehall. Alack! Alack! they said, some great mischief is toward. We shall all be destroyed this night. What a sight is this, to see the queen's bedchamber full of armed men! The like was never seen or heard of before." In this night of terror, everyone lost their presence of mind but the queen. Her ministers and counsellors crowded round her, imploring her to take refuge in the Tower. Bishop Gardiner even fell on his knees to entreat her to enter a boat he had provided for her retreat at Whitehall Stairs. She answered, "that she would set no example of cowardice, and, if Pembroke and Clinton proved true to their post, she would not desert hers." In the midst of the confusion at St. James's, the hot gospeller, Mr. Edward Underhill, came again, dressed in armour, and was very thankfully admitted by the captain of the Queen's Guard, who could best appreciate his valour and fidelity to his standard. The Queen sent information to Pembroke and Clinton of the alarm in the palace. They returned the most earnest assurances of their fidelity. At 4 o'clock in the morning their drums beat to arms, and they began to station their forces, for the most effectual defence of the royal palaces of St. James and Whitehall, the rebels being uncertain in which Queen Mary had sojourned that night. The Queen had a very small force of infantry, but was better provided with cavalry, which was under the command of Lord Clinton, the husband of her friend and kinswoman, the fair Geraldine. Bands of soldiers were posted, at intervals, from Charing Cross to St. James's Palace, and on the hill opposite to the palace gateway, now so familiarly known by the name of St. James's Street, was planted a battery of cannon, guarded by a strong squadron of horse, headed by Lord Clinton. This force extended from the spot where Crockford's Club House now stands, to Jermyn Street. The antique palace gateway and the hill still remain witnesses of the scene, but no building occupied at that time the vicinity of the palace, excepting a solitary conduit, standing where the centre of St. James's Square is at present. The whole area before the gateway was called St. James's Field, and where now extend the streets of Pall Mall and Piccadilly, with their swarming thousands, sylvan lanes then were seen, or park walls stretched on each side. After Clinton and Pembroke had arranged their plan of action, the approach of the enemy was eagerly expected. Day broke on the 7th of February, slowly and sullenly, pouring with rain, a real London wintry morning. The difficulty of bringing up artillery through roads, such as roads were in those days, made still worse by the wet weather, had delayed Wyatt's entry till 9 o'clock, when his forces, finding all access to the higher ground strongly guarded, divided into three. One part, under the command of Captain Cobham, approached Westminster, through the park, assaulting the back of St. James's Palace, as they went. The second, led by Captain Knevet, attacked Whitehall, while the other, led by Sir Thomas Wyatt, made their way down Old St. James's Lane, which seems no other than the site of Piccadilly. Wyatt had been promised, by his friends in the city, that Ludgate should be open to him, if he could make his way thither. Therefore, without providing for a retreat, he bent all his energies on the point of forcing a passage to that main entrance of the city. Lord Clinton permitted a small number of his followers to pass before he charged down St. James's Hill, and commenced the contest, by severing the leader from his unwieldy army. Nevertheless, without heeding the battle in his rear, Wyatt and his men pushed on, to gain Ludgate. Two fierce assaults were, meantime, made simultaneously by the leaders of his main army, Knevet and Cobham. One attacked the palace of Whitehall, the other that of St. James. A division of the Queen's Guards, under the command of Sir Henry Jerningham, made good the defence of the latter, but Whitehall was in the utmost danger, for the remainder of the guards, headed by Sir John Gage, who, though a valiant cavalier, was an aged man, gave way before the overwhelming force. At that alarming crisis, Queen Mary stood in the gallery over the Holbein gateway at Whitehall, which, it should be remembered, intersected the way near the present banqueting house, and commanded a view up the vista, now called Parliament Street. Here she saw her guards broken and utterly dispersed by Knevet. Sir John Gage was overthrown in the dirt, but he succeeded in rising again, and made good his retreat to Whitehall. The defeated guards rushed into the courtyard of the palace, and fled to hide themselves among the wood and scullery offices. The gentlemen at arms, who were guarding the hall against attack, all ran out to see the cause of the uproar, when the porter flung to the gates, and locked all out, friend and foe. The gentlemen at arms were by no means satisfied with the precaution of the palace porter, and did not like their station with the gates locked behind them. Meantime, Sir Robert Southwell came round from one of the back yards, and the battle-axe gentleman begged he would represent to the Queen that it was a scandal to lock the palace gates on them, but, if she would only trust to them, she should soon see her enemies fall before her face. My masters, said Sir Robert, putting his morion from his head, I desire ye all, as ye be gentlemen, to stay yourselves here, while I go up to the queen, and I doubt not, she will order the gates to be opened. As I am a gentleman, I promise you to be speedy. He entered the palace by some private door to which he had access, and made a quick return. My masters, said he, the queen was content the gates should be opened, but her request is, that ye go no forth from her sight, for her sole trust for the defence of her person is in you. The palace gates were then flung boldly open, and the battle-axed gentlemen marched up and down, before the gallery where the queen stood. When they were mustered, she spoke to them, telling them that, as gentlemen in whom she trusted, she required them not to leave the spot. The legal gentlemen who assumed armour when pleading at Westminster Hall did not wear it wholly for their own preservation. Some of them offered their services for the defence of their liege lady. My father, says Ralph Rokeby, the lively historian of the family celebrated by Sir Walter Scott, went to Westminster Hall to plead, with a good coat armour under his sergeant's robes, but hearing at Charing Cross the approach of Wyatt and his rebels, he hastened to the defence of the queen at Whitehall. There he strung and fetted an archer's bow of the livery guard that stood aside unstrung, and, throwing aside his sergeant's robe, he went to the gatehouse of the palace, and made good use of it with a sheaf of arrows. Wyatt was, in the meantime, forcing the passes down the Strand to Ludgate, which were guarded with bands of soldiers commanded by Courtenay, Earl of Devonshire, and the Earl of Worcester. Courtenay scampered off at the first approach of Wyatt. It was supposed that timidity, from his inexperience in arms, had caused him to show the white feather, but he really was a secret coadjutor of Wyatt, and willing to clear the way for him, though his manner of doing it was not likely to render him very popular with the fierce people over whom he wished to reign. Wyatt and his force then approached Ludgate, and summoned the warder to surrender, but instead of his citizen partisan, who, he supposed, had the keeping of that important city entrance, Lord William Howard appeared in the gallery over the portal, and replied sternly, Avaunt, traitor, avaunt! You enter not here. There was no resource for Wyatt but to fight his way back to his main body. The queen's forces were between him and his army. Urged by despair, he renewed the contest with great fury near Charing Cross. Meantime, Courtenay rushed into the presence of the queen, crying out, that her battle was broke, that all was lost, and surrendered to Wyatt. The lion spirit of her race rose in the breast of Mary, and she replied, with infinite disdain, such was the fond opinion of those who durst not go near enough to see the truth of the trial, adding, that she herself would immediately enter into the battle, and abide the upshot of her rightful quarrel, or die with the brave men then fighting for her. And so, continues old Holinshed, she prepared herself accordingly. Whitehall was at that moment assaulted in the rear by Cobham's forces, who had forced their way through the park from St. James's, while the contest still raged in the area of Charing Cross. The band of gentlemen at arms were very earnestly engaged in defence of the royal residence. Part kept the rebels at bay in the rear of the palace, while others defended the courtyard and gateway with their battle-axes. Fugitives from the battle ever and anon took refuge in the palace, crying out, all is lost! Away! Away! A barge! A barge! Yet the queen never changed her cheer, nor would desert Whitehall, but asked, where was Lord Pembroke? And being answered, he was in the battle. Well then, she replied, all that dare not fight may fall to prayers, and I warrant we shall hear better news anon. God will not deceive me, in whom my chief trust is. Within the palace reigned the utmost terror. Such running and shrieking of gentlewomen, such shutting to of doors and windows, as was appalling to hear. While this uproar prevailed, the queen actually came out of the palace, among the gentlemen at arms, and stood between two of them, within arquebus shot of the enemy, when Pembroke made the final charge, which decided the fortune of the day. The difficulty was, in this last struggle, to tell friends from foes. The adversaries, says Holinshed, could only be distinguished by the mire, which had adhered to their garments in their dirty march from Brentford, and the war cry that morning by the queen's troops was, "Down with the draggle-tails!" The noise at Charing Cross, when Wyatt's forces were finally broken, was plainly heard by the Marquess of Northampton and his fellow prisoners, as they stood on the leads of the White Tower of London. The shrieking of women and children was absolutely terrific, though it does not appear that any of them were hurt in the fray. Wyatt was forced down Fleet Street, whence there was no retreat. He sat down, fatigued and dispirited, on a fish stall opposite to Bell Savage's Inn, and was finally prevailed on to surrender by Sir Maurice Berkeley, an unarmed cavalier, who took him up behind him and carried him to court as a prisoner, whence he was conveyed to the Tower. The band of gentlemen at arms were soon after admitted to the queen's presence, who thanked them graciously for their valiant defence of her person and palace. They were all of them gentlemen of family, and many of them possessors of great landed estates. This was, in the time of the Tudors, the most splendid band of royal guards in Europe. The most dolorous consequence of this rebellion was, that the queen was beset on all sides with importunities for the execution of the hapless Lady Jane Grey, against whom the fatal facts of her reproclamation as queen by her father and at Rochester by some of Wyatt's London allies were urged vehemently. Poinet, the Protestant bishop of Winchester, affirms, that those lords of the council who had been the most instrumental at the death of Edward VI, in thrusting royalty upon poor Lady Jane, and proclaiming Mary illegitimate, were now the sorest forcers of men, yea, became earnest counsellors for that innocent lady's death. These were the Earl of Pembroke and the Marquess of Winchester, afterwards prosperous men at the court of Elisabeth. The day after the contest with Wyatt, Queen Mary came to Temple Bar, and there, on the very ground saturated with the blood of her subjects, she was persuaded to sign the death warrant of her hapless kinswoman, on the plea that such scenes would be frequent while she suffered the competitor for her throne to exist. The warrant specified that Guildford Dudley and his wife were to be executed on the 9th of February. It was evidently a measure impelled by the exigency of the moment, before Queen Mary had lost the impression of the blood lately shed around her, and of the numerous executions which must, perforce, follow the rebellion. Sudden as the order was, Lady Jane Grey declared she was prepared for it. Dr. Feckenham, the queen's chaplain, who had had frequent conferences with the angelic victim since her imprisonment, was deputed to prepare her for this hurried death. Lady Jane was on friendly terms with him, but was naturally anxious to be spared the harassing discussion of their differing creeds. She therefore declined disputing with him, saying, that her time was too short for controversy. Upon this, Feckenham flew to the queen, and represented to her, that indeed the time was fearfully short for preparation of any kind, and how could she expect Lady Jane to die a Catholic, if she was hurried thus to the block without time for conviction? The queen immediately respited the execution for 3 days. Lady Jane smiled mournfully on her zealous friend, when he brought her news of this delay. She told him, he had mistaken her meaning, she wished not for delay of her sentence, but for quiet from polemic disputation. The meek angel added, that she was prepared to receive patiently her death in any manner it would please the queen to appoint. True it was her flesh shuddered, as was natural to frail mortality, but her spirit would spring rejoicingly into the eternal light, where she hoped the mercy of God would receive it. The memory of this beautiful message to Queen Mary, far more touching than any anecdote our Church of England historians have recorded of Lady Jane Grey, was preserved by Feckenham, who, though he succeeded not in turning the heavenly minded prisoner from the Protestant religion, won her friendship and gratitude. Her last words bore witness to the humanity and kindness she received from him. The executions of this lovely and innocent girl and her young husband must ever be considered frightful stains on the reign of a female sovereign. Since the War of the Roses, the excitable turbulence of the people would never permit any near connections of the crown to rest in peace without making their names the excuse for civil war. But if queen Mary considered herself impelled to the sacrifice by inexorable necessity, she neither aggravated it by malicious observations, nor by hypocritical conduct. Watch was kept night and day, in armour, at court, so great was the panic at the crisis. The city presented the most frightful scenes, for military law was executed on 50 of the trained bands, who deserted the queen's standard under Bret. These deserters, being all citizens, many were hung at their own doors, and left there. So that, according to the Italian eyewitness, the queen could not go to the city without beholding the ugly sight of dangling corpses at every turn of the street. But let those who live in our blessed times of peacefulness imagine, if they can, the agony of the harmless families within the houses, children, wife, mother, or sisters, who saw a dear, perhaps an only protector, thus hanging before his own doorway. What tragedy has ever equaled such a woe? Yet the numbers put to death in this insurrection, about 60, were trifling, in comparison with the victims of rebellions in the preceding and succeeding reigns, and few persons were sacrificed who were not guilty of a breach of trust. The prisoners taken in arms of Wyatt's army, amounting to 500, were led to the tilt-yard at Whitehall, with ropes about their necks. The queen appeared in the gallery above, and pronounced their pardon. Notwithstanding this act of personal forgiveness, many of these prisoners were sent to take their trials, but the sheriff of Kent sent word to the queen of the fact, when she promptly interfered, saying, "I have pardoned them once, and they shall not be further vexed." Another proof that Mary was far more merciful than her ministers. The same day that Lady Jane Grey was executed, the Earl of Devonshire was sent to the Tower, with a great company of guards, according to a letter written the same evening to the Earl of Shrewsbury, which adds, "The Lady Elisabeth was sent for 3 days ago, but yet she is not come, whatsoever the let or hindrance is." In fact, the confessions of Sir Thomas Wyatt, and some others, gave Queen Mary notice of a competitor for her crown, still nearer to her than the candid and angelic Jane, whose life she had just sacrificed. This was her sister, the Princess Elisabeth. On the outbreak of the strife, the queen had sent for Elisabeth from Ashridge, by the following letter, written in her own hand. Right dearly and entirely beloved sister, we greet you well. And whereas certain ill-disposed persons, minding more the satisfaction of their malicious minds than their duty of allegiance towards us, have, of late, spread divers untrue rumours, and by that means, and other devilish practices, do travail to induce our good and loving subjects to an unnatural rebellion against God and us, and the common tranquillity of our realm, we, tendering the surety of your person, which might chance to come to some peril, if any sudden tumult should arise, either where you now be or about Donnington, whither we understand you are bound shortly to remove, do therefore think expedient, you should put yourself in good readiness with all convenient speed to make your repair hither to us, which we pray you will not fail to do, assuring you that you will be most heartily welcome to us. Of your mind herein, we pray you return answer by this messenger, and thus we pray God to have you in his holy keeping. Given under our signet at our manor of St. James, the 26th of January, the first of our reign. Your loving sister, Mary the Queen. Elisabeth was very ill, and pleaded to the messenger, mentioned by the queen, that she was utterly unable to travel. Mary permitted her to remain a fortnight, waiting for convalescence. Accusations, however, were made against her by Wyatt, were partially confirmed by Sir James Croft, who had been made prisoner in an abortive attempt to raise an insurrection in Wales, simultaneously with those in Kent and Devonshire. The queen then sent imperatively for Elisabeth, yet showed consideration for her, by the person dispatched to bring her to Whitehall. This was Lord William Howard, who was not only her great uncle, brother to Anne Boleyn's mother, but the kindest friend she had in the world. The queen sent with all her own litter for her sister's accommodation and her 3 physicians, to ascertain whether she could travel without danger. Before the princess Elizabeth arrived at Whitehall, the queen had heard so many charges against her, that she would not see her, but assigned her a secure corner of the palace to abide in. She had formerly given Elizabeth a ring as a token, and told her to send it, if at any time there should be anger between them. Elizabeth sent it to her at this alarming crisis, but was answered, that she must clear herself from the serious imputations alleged against her before they could meet. It was fortunate for Elizabeth that the queen meant conscientiously to abide by the ancient constitutional law of England, restored in her first parliament, which required, that an overt or open act of treason must be proved, before any English person could be attainted as a traitor. Courtenay was, as well as Elizabeth, in disgrace. He had been arrested a few days after the contest with Wyatt, and sent to the Tower. It is to Queen Mary's credit that she urged the law of her country to the Spanish ambassador when he informed her that her marriage with the Prince of Spain could not be concluded till Courtenay and Elizabeth were punished. The Spaniard thus quotes her words to his master, Charles V. The queen replied, that she and her council were labouring as much as possible to discover the truth as to the practices of Elizabeth and Courtenay, and that, as to Courtenay, it was certain he was accused by many of the prisoners of consenting and assisting in the plot, and that the cipher by which he corresponded with Sir Peter Carew had been discovered cut on his guitar, that he was intrigued with the French, and that a match had been projected between him and Elizabeth, which was to be followed by the deposition and death of her, the queen. Yet the law of England condemns to death only those who have committed overt acts of treason. Those who have merely implied consent by silence are punished but by imprisonment, and sometimes by confiscation of goods. Renaud angrily observes elsewhere, that it was evident the queen wished to save Courtenay, and of course Elizabeth, since she does not allow that her guilt was as manifest as his. Correspondence, of a nature calculated to enrage any sovereign, was discovered, which deeply implicated Elizabeth. Notwithstanding all that has been urged against Mary, it is evident, from the letters of the Spanish ambassador, that she proved her sister's best friend, by remaining steadfast to her expressed determination, that, although she was convinced of the deep dissimulation of Elizabeth's character, who was in this instance what she had always shown herself, yet proof, open proof, must be brought against her before any harsher measures than temporary imprisonment were adopted. In short, whatever adverse colours may be cast on a portion of her history which really does her credit, the conclusion, built on the irrefragable structure of results, is this: Mary dealt infinitely more mercifully by her heiress than Elizabeth did by hers. And how startling is the fact, that Queen Mary would not proceed against her sister and her kinsman, because the proof of their treason was contained in cipher letters, easy to be forged, when correspondence in cipher brought Mary Queen of Scots to the block, protesting, as she did, that the correspondence was forged. End of section 21.